Lady Vela Sorrenti stood at the window of her chamber and watched the human ship descend through the clouds of Cala Prime. The vessel was small and ugly compared to the elegant Kalori cruisers that filled the skies of her world, and she felt her stomach turn with dread as she realized that her future husband was aboard that graceless metal box. She was the third daughter of the High Matriarch, which meant she was valuable enough to matter, but not valuable enough to protect from political necessity. And the Galactic Concord had decided that her marriage to a human would seal the alliance between her ancient empire and the newest species to reach the stars. The Kalori had ruled their sector of space for 12,000 years, and they had watched countless younger races rise and fall like waves against an eternal shore. So when humanity emerged from their small blue world with their primitive ships and their loud voices and their strange passion for everything they encountered, the Kalori had simply added them to the long list of species that would eventually fade into history. But the Concord wanted unity, and unity required gestures, and gestures required sacrifice. And so Vela had been chosen to marry a human she had never met. Her attendants dressed her in ceremonial robes of silver and deep blue as the ship landed in the palace courtyard below. And she tried to imagine what sort of creature would step off that vessel to claim her as his wife. The humans were known throughout the galaxy as a peculiar species, soft and fragile and shockingly short-lived, burning through their tiny lifespans with a desperate energy that other races found exhausting to witness. And Vela had heard stories of human diplomats who talked too much, and human traders who pushed too hard, and human soldiers who fought with a reckless fury that seemed almost suicidal. She expected her husband to be loud and demanding and difficult to manage. She prepared herself for years of patience and quiet suffering. The palace guards escorted the human to the greeting hall where Vale waited with her mother and sisters, and she straightened her spine and lifted her chin as the doors opened to reveal her fate. He was smaller than she expected. The human stood perhaps a head shorter than the average Kalori male, with dark hair cut close to his skull and skin the color of warm bronze. And he wore simple clothing that looked more suited to a worker than a diplomatic husband. And at his hip hung a long curved blade in a worn leather sheath. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and when they met hers across the hall, Vela saw something she did not expect: silence. Not the emptiness of a simple mind, but the stillness of deep water. And she felt a strange shiver run down her spine as he walked toward her with quiet steps that made no sound on the marble floor. The High Matriarch spoke the formal words of greeting that tradition demanded, and the human listened without expression and responded in Kalori that was accented but correct. And his voice was low and soft, and he used only the words that were necessary and not a single syllable more. His name was Elias Ward. He had been a soldier once, the document said, though they did not specify what kind or where he had served. And he had volunteered for the diplomatic marriage program because no one else had wanted the assignment. The other humans considered marriage to an alien species a strange fate, and the Kalori considered humans beneath their notice. So Elias Ward had stepped forward to fill a role that no one else desired. Vela studied him as the ceremonies continued, and found herself confused by what she observed. He did not boast or posture or try to impress anyone with tales of human achievement, and he did not complain about the unfamiliar food or the strange customs or the way the Kalori guards looked at him with barely hidden contempt, and he answered questions with brief sentences and asked nothing in return. When the wedding ritual was complete and they were bound together by Kalori law, he simply nodded and followed her to their shared quarters without comment. The first night of their marriage passed in silence. Elias slept on a mat he unrolled on the floor, leaving the large bed to Vela, and she lay awake for hours, wondering what sort of man she had married and what secrets hid behind those storm-colored eyes. The days became weeks, and the weeks became months. And Vela learned that her husband was a creature of routine and discipline. He woke before dawn every morning and went to the small courtyard outside their quarters. And there he drew the curved blade from his hip and moved through a series of forms that looked like dancing and fighting, combined into something beautiful and strange. The Kalori guards who watched him laughed at first, mocking his primitive weapon and his slow, careful movements. But Vela noticed that their laughter faded over time as they watched him practice day after day without rest or complaint. She tried to speak with him in the evenings, asking about his home world and his family and his life before he came to Calaprime. But his answers were always brief and his eyes always distant. And she learned more from what he did not say than from what he did. He had no family left. She gathered from the spaces between his words. He had seen things that still haunted him when he slept. And sometimes she heard him cry out in the night in a language she did not understand. The cord whispered that the human was simple or broken, damaged goods that Earth had sent to fulfill an obligation they did not value. And Vela began to believe they might be right. But sometimes she caught him watching her when he thought she was not looking. And in those moments, she saw something flicker in his eyes that was not emptiness at all. It was attention. He was studying her world and her people with the patience of a hunter learning the habits of prey. And she realized with a chill that the silence was not weakness. It was waiting. She did not know what Elias Ward was waiting for. And part of her was afraid to find out. But another part of her felt something she had not expected when she agreed to this marriage. Curiosity, and perhaps, in the quiet moments when he sat beside her and said nothing, but somehow made her feel less alone, something that might eventually become more. 3 years passed on Calaprime, and Vela discovered that she had grown fond of her strange, silent husband. Change happened so slowly that she did not notice it at first. Like the way a river shapes stone through countless small touches over endless time. And by the time she realized how much Elias had become part of her life, she could not remember what it felt like to live without him. He still spoke only when necessary. But she had learned to read the language of his silences. And she knew the difference between the quiet of contentment and the quiet of sorrow, and the quiet of anger that he kept locked tight. Behind his storm-colored eyes, she learned that he smiled sometimes, though it was rare and quick and easy to miss if she was not watching for it. And she learned that he had a dry sense of humor that emerged in unexpected moments and caught her by surprise once when a pompous Kalori noble spent an entire dinner boasting about his ancient bloodline and his many accomplishments. Elias had leaned close to Vela and whispered that the noble reminded him of a bird from Earth called a peacock that had beautiful feathers and an ugly voice and a brain the size of a seed. Vela had nearly choked on her wine trying not to laugh. And for just a moment she had seen warmth in her husband's eyes that made her heart skip in a way she did not expect. The court still treated him with contempt or pity depending on their mood. But Elias never seemed to notice or care, and he went about his quiet routines with a patience that Vela found both frustrating and admirable. He trained with his blade every morning without fail. And she began to watch him from her window as the first light of dawn painted the courtyard in shades of gold and pink. She had seen Kalori warriors practice their arts many times, and they moved with speed and power that seemed impossible to match. But there was something different about the way Elias handled his weapon. He moved like water flowing around stone, like wind passing through leaves, like something that had no solid form to strike or hold. And his blade caught the light in ways that made it seem alive in his hands. One morning she gathered her courage and went down to the courtyard to watch him from closer. He paused when he saw her but did not stop. And she sat on a stone bench and observed as he continued his forms with the same careful focus he brought to everything he did when he finished. He was breathing hard and sweat gleamed on his bronze skin. But his hands were perfectly steady as he slid the blade back into its worn sheath. She asked him where he learned to fight like that, and he was quiet for a long moment before he answered. He told her that the art was called Kenjutsu and that it had been practiced on Earth for over 1,000 years, passed down from master to student through countless generations. And he had learned it from his grandfather, who had learned it from his mother, who had learned it from her father. She asked him why he still practiced when the galaxy had weapons that could destroy cities from orbit, and his old blade seemed like a relic from a forgotten age. He looked at her with those storm-colored eyes and said that some things were worth keeping alive. Even when the world moved on, she felt something shift between them in that moment. Though she could not name what it was, the seasons changed and Vela's mother grew ill with a sickness that no healer could cure. And the High Matriarch faded slowly over many months, until finally she passed into the next world with her daughters at her side. Kalori. Tradition demanded that the royal family show no grief in public, and Vela stood through the funeral ceremonies with her back straight and her face empty, while her heart broke into pieces inside her chest. That night she fled to the gardens behind the palace, where the flowers bloomed in colors that had no names and the stars burned cold and distant overhead. She did not know how long she sat there in the dark before she heard soft footsteps behind her. Elias did not speak. He simply sat down beside her on the stone bench and looked up at the stars with her, and his presence was warm and solid and real in a way that made her feel less alone in her grief. She cried then, letting the tears fall for the first time since her mother's death. And he still said nothing, but he reached out and took her hand in his and held it gently until her tears ran dry. When she finally found her voice again, she asked him why he had come to find her, and he said that he knew what it felt like to lose someone, and that no one should have to feel that alone. She asked him who he had lost, and his hand tightened on hers for just a moment before he answered. He had lost everyone. The words were simple, but the weight of them was crushing. And Vela understood then that her husband carried scars that went far deeper than anything she had imagined. She did not push him for details, because she knew he would share them only when he was ready. And instead she leaned her head against his shoulder and let the silence wrap around them like a blanket. They sat together until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. And when they finally rose to return to the palace, something had changed between them. It was not love. Not yet, but it was the foundation on which love might someday be built, to trust and understanding, a recognition that they were both broken in their own ways, and that perhaps broken things could help each other become whole again. Vela looked at her silent husband as they walked through the garden paths and realized that she no longer saw him as an obligation or a burden. She saw him as a partner, and somewhere deep in her chest, in the place where her grief still ached like a fresh wound, she felt a small warm spark of something that might have been hope. The warning came at midnight when the stars above Calaprime began to disappear, one by one, as something vast and dark moved across the sky. Vela was torn from sleep by the screaming of alarms that had not sounded in 1,000 years, and she ran to the window of her chamber to see the night filled with fire and falling debris as the orbital defense platforms exploded in silence. Far above the atmosphere, Elias was already awake and dressed, his blade at his hip and his eyes sharp with a focus she had never seen before. And when he looked at her, she saw something in his face that made her blood run cold. He was not surprised. He had been waiting for this. The palace fell into chaos as reports flooded in from across the sector, and Vela learned the name of the enemy that had come to devour her world, the Vraxith. She had heard the name before in old histories and older nightmares. a species from beyond the edge of the galaxy that moved like locusts across the stars, consuming everything in their path and leaving nothing behind but dead worlds and scattered bones. They had destroyed civilizations that existed before the Keylori had learned to make fire. And they had been quiet for so long that most species had convinced themselves the threat was gone forever. They were wrong. The Vraxith horde numbered in the billions, a swarm of chitinous horrors that felt no fear and knew no mercy. And they fell upon the outer worlds of the Kalari Dominion like a tide of hungry mouths. The Kalari fleet responded with all the power of 12,000 years of technological advancement. And for a brief moment, the people of the Empire believed they might hold the line. Then the fleet was destroyed. Vela watched the reports come in with growing horror as world after world went silent. Their populations consumed or scattered or simply erased from existence. And the Vraxith advance did not slow or hesitate or show any sign of stopping. The Galactic Concord sent desperate messages to every member species, begging for assistance. But the other empires were dealing with their own invasions as the Vraxith spread across the galaxy like a disease. And the humans promised to send their fleets as fast as they could, but Earth was months away, and the Vraxith would reach Calaprime in days. Her sister Nalith became the new High Matriarch when their eldest sister fell defending the border. And Nalith ordered the evacuation of as many civilians as possible, while the remaining military forces prepared for a last stand. Vela refused to leave. This was her home and her people, and she would not abandon them even if it meant her death. And she took command of the palace guard and began preparing the ancient fortress for a siege. It was never designed to survive. Elias worked beside her without complaint, carrying supplies and reinforcing barricades and helping organize the frightened refugees who had nowhere else to go. And she noticed that the guards who had mocked him for years now looked at him with something like respect. He moved with a purpose that seemed almost eager, like a tool that had been waiting in a drawer for years, finally being taken out for the use it was made for. And when she asked him if he was afraid, he looked at her with those storm-colored eyes and shook his head. She asked him what he felt instead, and he was quiet for a moment before he answered, "Ready." The word sent a chill down her spine. The Vraxith reached Calaprime on the 5th day, and the sky turned black with their landing craft as millions of the creatures descended upon the capital city. The ground forces fought with desperate courage, but they were overwhelmed within hours. And the Vraxith poured through the streets like a flood of claws and teeth and hunger. And the screaming of the dying filled the air until it seemed like the whole world was made of nothing but pain and terror. The palace gates held longer than anyone expected. But even ancient Keylori engineering could not stand forever against the weight of 1,000,000 hungry bodies. And by nightfall, Vela knew that the end was coming. She gathered the last of her guards in the armory and told them that she was proud to die beside them. And she strapped on ceremonial armor that had been worn by her ancestors in wars long forgotten and took up a plasma rifle that felt too heavy in her. Shaking hands, she was ready to die as a daughter of her house should die, facing the enemy, fighting until the last breath left her body. Then Elias stepped through the door of the armory and everything changed. He had removed the simple clothes he usually wore and replaced them with something she had never seen before. A suit of armor that was clearly human in design, but old and worn and scarred with the marks of countless battles. He looked at her with those storm-colored eyes and said 2 words in a voice that was calm and certain and absolutely without fear. "Stay behind me." She started to argue because there were thousands of Vraxith, and he was just one man with a primitive blade. But the words died in her throat when he drew his weapon, and she saw what he truly was for the first time. The blade sang as it left the sheath, a sound like a single perfect note of music, and it caught the light of the torches in a way that made it seemed to glow with an inner fire, Elias turned toward the door that led to the main hall, where the sound of breaking metal told her the Vraxith had finally breached the inner defenses. And he moved with a grace that seemed impossible for any creature made of flesh and bone. Vela understood then why humanity had sent this one quiet man to marry into the most powerful empire in the galaxy. They had not sent him because he was expendable. They had sent him because he was a message, a promise, a warning of what would come if anyone dared to harm what humanity had claimed as its own. And as Elias Ward walked toward the sound of monsters with his ancient blade held ready, Vela realized that she was about to see what humans were truly capable of when they had something worth fighting for. The Vraxith burst through the palace gates like a wave of nightmares given flesh. They were larger than Vela had imagined, standing taller than any Kalori warrior, with bodies covered in black chitin that gleamed like wet stone in the torchlight. And their limbs ended in claws that could tear through metal as easily as paper. And their mouths were filled with rows of teeth designed for one purpose, only consumption. They poured into the main hall by the dozens, then by the hundreds, their clicks and shrieks filling the air with a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And the Kalori guards raised their weapons and prepared to sell their lives as dearly as they could. Elias Ward walked forward to meet them. He did not run or charge or scream a battle cry like the warriors in the old stories, but simply walked with that same quiet grace he brought to everything he did. And his blade caught the light in a way that made it seem to burn with cold fire. The first Vraxith to reach him was fast, faster than anything Vela had ever seen, its claws sweeping toward his head in a strike that should have ended his life before the battle even began. Elias moved. He did not block or dodge or retreat, but flowed around the attack like water around a stone. And his blade flickered once in the torchlight, and the Vraxith fell in two pieces that twitched and spasmed on the marble floor. The silence lasted for a heartbeat. Then the swarm Atiket Vela had witnessed Kalori warriors in training her entire life, had seen the best fighters of her people demonstrate techniques passed down through countless generations. And she had thought she understood what combat looked like. She was wrong. Elias Ward fought like nothing she had ever seen or imagined, like something from the ancient legends when gods walked among mortals and death itself took physical form. And his blade moved so fast it became a blur of silver light that painted arcs of destruction through the Vraxith horde. He cut through chitin and flesh and bone as if they were made of nothing more substantial than smoke. And black ichor sprayed through the air in fountains as creature after creature fell before his advance. The Vraxith were predators who had never known fear, who had devoured civilizations that existed before the stars were young. And they had never encountered prey that did not flee or freeze or beg for mercy. They did not know how to fight something that moved toward them. Elias did not retreat or defend or try to hold a line, but pushed forward into the mass of bodies with a relentless determination that seemed almost mechanical. And his blade sang its killing song as he carved a path through enemies that should have overwhelmed him in seconds. Vela watched in stunned disbelief as her husband became something she did not recognize, something beautiful and terrible and utterly without mercy. And she understood at last why the humans called their ancient warriors by names that inspired dread. Samurai, the word meant one who serves. Elias had told her once, and she had not understood what he meant until now. He served death itself. The battle stretched on for hours that felt like days, and the Vraxith kept coming in endless waves that crashed against Elias like water against a cliff. And still he did not fall. His armor was torn, and his body was covered in wounds that would have killed a lesser warrior. But he kept fighting with that same terrible grace. And the floor of the main hall became slick with black ichor, and the bodies of the fallen piled higher and higher. Around him, the Kalori guards tried to support him with covering fire from their positions, but they could barely track his movements. And more than one stopped shooting entirely because they were too stunned by what they witnessed to remember their training. Vela found herself praying to gods she had stopped believing in as a child, begging them to give her husband the strength to survive, to let him live through this nightmare, to bring him back to her when the killing was done. The dawn came slowly, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, and still the battle continued. Ilias was slowing now, his movements less fluid and more desperate as exhaustion began to take its toll. And Vela saw that his blade was chipped and stained, and his armor hung in tatters from his wounded body, but still he fought. Still he killed. Still he stood between the Vraxith and the people he had sworn to protect. Sound of explosions in the distance told Vela that reinforcements had finally arrived from the outer districts, and the Vraxith began to hesitate as they sensed the tide of battle turning against them. Ilias did not hesitate. He pressed his attack with renewed fury, driving into the wavering swarm like a blade into flesh. And the Vraxith broke. They fled for the first time in the long, terrible history of their species. The Vraxith turned and ran from a single enemy, and their shrieks of fear echoed through the ruined halls as they scrambled over the bodies of their fallen to escape the nightmare in human form that had slaughtered them by the hundreds. Vela ran to her husband as the last of the creatures disappeared into the morning light. He stood in the center of the main hall, surrounded by a mountain of dead Vraxith, his blade still raised and his body trembling with exhaustion. And when she reached him, he turned to look at her, with eyes that were empty and haunted, and filled with a pain she could not imagine. She took his face in her hands and called his name until the emptiness faded and he saw her again, truly saw her. And then his legs gave out and he collapsed into her arms. The blade fell from his fingers and clattered against the bloody floor. 9 hours he had fought. For 9 hours. Without rest he had killed over 1,000 Vraxith with nothing but a blade of ancient steel and a will that refused to break. Vela held her husband as the Kalori soldiers flooded into the hall and stared at the carnage with expressions of shock and disbelief. And she whispered promises against his blood-matted hair that she would never let him go, never forget what he had done, never stop loving the quiet man who had saved everything she held dear. The galaxy would learn what happened this day. The galaxy would remember, and the galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. The human fleets arrived 1 week after the Battle of the Palace Gates and found a galaxy that had already changed forever. They came with warships bristling with weapons that made Kalori technology look like children's toys, and they swept through the Vraxith swarms with a cold efficiency that left the ancient empires of the Concord speechless with shock. The locusts, who had devoured civilizations older than memory, broke against humanity's iron fist like waves against a cliff. And within 3 months, the invasion was over, and the Vraxith were retreating back toward the dark spaces between galaxies where they had hidden for so long. But the true victory had already been won by one man with an ancient blade, and the story of Elias Ward spread through the galaxy faster than light itself could travel. They called him the Silent Blade in some languages, and the Gatekeeper in others, and the Human Devil in the frightened whispers of the Vraxith survivors, and diplomats who had dismissed humanity as primitive newcomers now sat in respectful silence when human representatives entered the room. Military strategists from 100 different species began studying human history with growing unease, discovering a people who had never stopped fighting. Since the first moment they climbed down from the trees of their homeworld, they found records of human wars that lasted generations and weapons designed for nothing but killing and philosophies of combat refined through thousands of years of bloodshed into something that was almost beautiful in its terrible efficiency. The Kalori looked at their old files on humanity and realized they had made a catastrophic error in judgment. They had seen a species with soft skin and short lifespans and fragile bodies, and assumed that meant weakness. They had not understood that humanity's fragility was precisely what made them so dangerous, a species that could die from a fall or a fever or 100 other small misfortunes had learned to fight with a desperation that longer-lived races could not match. And they had poured that desperation into their arts of war until they became something the galaxy had never seen before. Predators who hunted other predators, Vela watched her husband deal with his new fame with the same quiet patience he brought to everything else in his life. He refused every honor the Kalori tried to give him, turning down titles and lands and wealth with polite words that left the nobles confused and frustrated. And he declined every request for interviews or public appearances with a simple shake of his head. He returned to their quarters and resumed his old routines as if nothing had changed, waking before dawn to practice with his blade and eating his meals in silence and sitting beside Vela in the evenings while she read or worked. But something had changed. She could see it in the shadows that lingered behind his eyes and the way his hands sometimes trembled when he thought she was not watching. And she knew that the battle had cost him something that could not be measured in blood or scars. The healers had repaired his body, but there were wounds inside him that no medicine could reach. She found him in the garden one night 3 weeks after the battle, sitting on the same stone bench where he had held her hand when her mother died, and his blade lay across his knees like a sleeping serpent. She sat down beside him and waited in the silence that had become their language. He spoke first, which surprised her, his voice rough and quiet in the darkness. He told her that he had killed 1,237 Vraxith in the main hall. He had counted every single one. Vela did not know what to say, so she simply reached out and took his hand. And she felt him trembling like a leaf in a storm. He told her about the colony where he had lived before he volunteered for the diplomatic program, a small world on the edge of human space where he had worked as a peacekeeper and married a woman named Sarah and raised a daughter named Maya. He told her about the raiders who came one night without warning, pirates from a species that saw humans as easy prey, and how he had fought to protect his family with everything he had. He told her that he had failed. Sarah had died in the first attack, killed by a plasma bolt meant for him, and Maya had been taken along with dozens of other children from the colony. And by the time the rescue ships arrived, the pirates were gone, and his daughter was gone, and everything that mattered was gone. He had searched for her for 3 years. He had followed every lead and chased every rumor and killed every pirate he could find. But Maya was never found, and eventually he had accepted that she was dead, and that he had failed to protect the only things in the universe that truly mattered. His grandfather had given him the blade when he was young, he said, and taught him that a sword was not just a weapon, but a promise to protect those who could not protect themselves. He had made that promise to Maya the day she was born, and sworn on his blade that he would always keep her safe. And he had broken that promise, and he did not know how to live with the weight of that failure. Vela felt tears running down her face as she listened to her husband finally share the burden he had carried alone for so long. She understood now why he had volunteered for the marriage program, why he had accepted exile to a distant world among people who did not want him. He had been running from his grief. He had been punishing himself for a failure that was not his fault. She turned to face him and took his face in her hands the way she had done in the bloody hall when the battle ended. And she told him something she should have said long ago. She told him that he had kept his promise. He had protected people who could not protect themselves. He had stood alone against 1,000 nightmares and refused to fall. And because of him, children were alive who would have been devoured. Families were whole who would have been destroyed, and a world was saved that would have been consumed. She told him that Maya would be proud of her father. She told him that she was proud of her husband. She told him that she loved him. The words hung in the air between them. And for a long moment, Elias said nothing. And then he let out a breath that seemed to carry years of pain and guilt and grief with it. He told her that he loved her too. He had loved her for a long time. He had been afraid to say it because everyone he loved seemed to die. And he could not bear the thought of losing her the way he had lost Sarah and Maya. She kissed him then under the cold light of alien stars, and she tasted salt on his lips from tears she had never seen him cry. And she held him until the trembling stopped and the shadows in his eyes began to fade. They sat together until dawn the way they had done once before. And when the light touched the garden, they rose and walked back to the palace, hand in hand. The galaxy had learned to fear humanity that day in the palace hall. But Vela had learned something far more important. She had learned that the quietest souls often carried the heaviest burdens. She had learned that strength was not measured in muscles or weapons, but in the will to keep fighting when everything seemed lost. And she had learned that sometimes the most terrifying thing in the universe was not a monster or a swarm or a weapon of unimaginable destruction. It was a human with something left to protect,